Since January 2024, at least 7 of Nigeria's most consequential federal appointments, spanning the NNPCC board, the CBN advisory structure, the National Security Council, and 2 key agency heads, have gone to individuals with direct documented ties to a single political architecture. An architecture that was never built for 2027. It was built for after 2027. Every analyst in Nigeria right now is debating whether Tinubu will win a second term, dissecting his approval ratings, mapping the opposition, running the electoral math. And while that conversation consumes Nigerian political media, nobody, almost nobody, is asking the more dangerous question. What has he already put in place to govern Nigeria regardless of what happens in 2027? Because there is a structural blueprint being quietly assembled. It lives in appointments that look routine, in constitutional amendments being floated as legislative housekeeping, and in a specific financial mechanism tied to the Federation account that has received almost no serious analytical attention. The people closest to this blueprint are not talking publicly, but the architecture itself is visible if you know what you're looking at. And the question that should be keeping every serious Nigerian politician awake right now is this: is Tinubu building a second-term campaign, or he's building something that makes the second-term question completely irrelevant? Stay with me. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis mainstream media is too afraid or too compromised to deliver. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. To understand what is actually being constructed, you need to understand what triggered this analysis and why 3 things that happened in a very short window, things that were reported separately and treated as unrelated, are in fact the same story. The first: in late 2024, Tinubu quietly signed off on a restructuring of the Presidential Advisory Council. The membership was expanded, but more importantly, the council was given a new mandate, one that overlaps with functions previously held by the National Economic Council. The NEC, for those who need the context, is constitutionally chaired by the Vice President. That overlap is not a bureaucratic accident. Mandates do not overlap by coincidence at this level of government. The second: the APC National Working Committee began an internal process not publicly announced, confirmed through party sources, reviewing the party's zoning formula ahead of 2027. The official framing is internal democracy. The actual effect would be to preemptively neutralize any northern consensus candidate before one can consolidate, before one can even fully emerge. And the third, and this is the one that most people who did cover it completely misread: a former top aide to the president, someone with direct visibility into Aso Rock's internal planning, gave an interview to a Lagos-based publication. It was widely treated as routine political commentary, background noise. But buried inside that interview was a specific phrase. The president, this aide said, is thinking beyond electoral cycles. That phrase was not spontaneous. In Nigerian political communication at that level, no phrase that precise is ever spontaneous. It was placed. It was a signal dressed as a remark. Now, the surface narrative being pushed by Tinubu's media operation is straightforward. A president consolidating support for an effective second-term bid, managing the internal dynamics of a dominant party, positioning Nigeria for investment and economic recovery. That is the story you are being fed, and it is not entirely false. It is simply incomplete in ways that matter enormously. The buried narrative is this: what is actually being constructed is a post-2027 power architecture, one designed to ensure that whether Tinubu wins in 2027, negotiates a transition, or faces an outcome he doesn't control, his network retains structural dominance over Nigeria's key institutions, revenue flows, and security apparatus for at least a decade beyond this election cycle. Now, for historical context, and I want to be precise here, not lazy with the comparison, after his second term, Obasanjo did not simply leave power. He attempted to extend it through a third-term constitutional agenda that collapsed in the National Assembly in 2006. When that failed, he engineered Umaru Yar'Adua as a controlled successor. The lesson that Tinubu, as a genuine student of Nigerian political history, would have extracted from that sequence is not don't try to extend your influence. The lesson is don't make it visible until it is already irreversible. And here is the fact that reframes everything you have just heard. The constitutional amendment bills currently before the National Assembly, being covered almost universally as routine legislative housekeeping, include a clause that would grant the president expanded emergency powers over state governors during, and I want you to note this phrase carefully, fiscal emergencies. The governors know this clause is there. The APC governors specifically know it, and these are men who have been loudly, publicly resistant to federal overreach on multiple other fronts. Their silence on this specific clause, from governors who are not generally silent when federal power threatens their autonomy, is a political signal, and that signal deserves serious interrogation.
Let's get precise about what is actually being worked, because this architecture has 4 institutional nodes, and they are being moved simultaneously. The first node is the National Assembly. The current NAS leadership, Senate President Godswill Akpabio and Speaker Tajuddin Abbas, was installed with direct support from Aso Rock. This is not a contested claim. What matters analytically is not the installation itself. It is what it was purchased with. The working arrangement that followed gives the executive significant influence over the legislative agenda. Which bills reach the floor? Which committee chairmanships are assigned? And this is the critical point: which constitutional amendment proposals survive committee review and which ones quietly die? These constitutional amendment bills I just described are not random legislative activity. They are sequenced. Someone decided what order they would be introduced in, and that sequencing is itself a strategy. The second node is the judiciary, specifically the Supreme Court. Since 2023, there have been 3 Supreme Court appointments. The constitutional framework gives the president the power to nominate, subject to Senate confirmation. The same Senate whose leadership owes its institutional position to the same executive. Now, on paper, the National Judicial Council provides a buffer against pure executive capture. In practice, the NJC's nominee shortlists have been subject to quiet executive pressure going back at least 2 administrations. This is not a Tinubu invention. But the question worth holding is this one: who holds the appointment power on the NJC and who appointed them? Because an institution that buffers executive power is only as independent as the people who run it, and the people who run it were put there by someone. The third node is the CBN and the Federation account architecture. The central bank under Cardoso has maintained a credible posture of technical independence, but I want to redirect your attention away from the CBN itself, because the real leverage point in this story is not the central bank, it is the Federation Account Allocation Committee and the growing, increasingly documented dispute over NNPCC remittances to the Federation account. Several state governors, including from the South-South and the Northwest, have raised serious public alarms about what they describe as irregular deductions and withheld remittances. These governors have been vocal. Their former legal challenge, however, has stalled. Understanding why it has stalled requires understanding who controls the Attorney General's office and what the AGF's relationship is to the fiscal architecture being built. That is not a rhetorical question. It has a specific answer. The fourth node is the APC gubernatorial structure. There are currently 21 APC governors. Of these, at least 11 are first-term governors who will need federal support, FAAC flows, security cooperation, party structure backing to survive their re-election cycles between 2026 and 2028. That dependence is leverage, real, immediate, operational leverage. And it is being used to manage the governor's public positions on constitutional changes and post-2027 agenda items. A governor who needs federal goodwill to win re-election is not a free agent when it comes to opposing the man whose goodwill he needs. Now, what checks exist on paper versus what actually happens? The Nigerian Constitution provides for separation of powers, an independent judiciary, and legislative oversight of executive appointments. These are real provisions. They function, however, only when the institutions exercising them have leadership that is either independently elected or sufficiently insulated from executive pressure. Right now, none of the four nodes I've just described meets that threshold simultaneously. The checks exist, the will to exercise them at the critical moment is the question. And Nigeria has been here before, though not in the way most people reach for when they make this comparison. The closest parallel is not Obasanjo's third-term push. It is Babangida's transition program of the late 1980s. IBB built an elaborate institutional architecture, parties, a constituent assembly, multiple transition timetables that was never actually designed to transfer power. It was designed to manage power while appearing to relinquish it. The annulment of June 12 was not a sudden decision made in panic. It was the end point of a structure that had been under construction for years, visible in retrospect, nearly invisible in real time. The lesson of June 12 is not simply that elections can be cancelled. The lesson is that by the time Nigerians could see clearly what had been built, it was already operational. There is one specific financial mechanism connecting the NNPCC remittance dispute, the fiscal dependence of state governors, and the constitutional amendment on emergency powers that I want you to keep in mind. When we get to what that mechanism actually does and who controls it, everything I've described will lock into place.
Let's start with the most visible beneficiary and work inward. Because the surface answer, Tinubu benefits, is true but insufficient. The question is how he benefits and over what time frame, and that is where the analysis gets genuinely revealing. A second term is valuable, but a second term that ends in 2031 and leaves Tinubu with no structural power, no institutional legacy, no durable influence over who comes next, that is not the goal of a politician who spent 25 years building the Lagos machine from near zero. The Lagos model was never about winning one election. It was about constructing a system that reproduced political outcomes reliably across administrations, across electoral cycles. The goal is durability, the ability to shape Nigerian politics from 2027 to at least 2035, whether from Aso Rock or from a position that doesn't carry that name. Now, who risks losing if this architecture completes? Three groups face structural erosion, and they are not equal in their capacity to resist. The northern establishment. The traditional northern power bloc centered around the Sokoto-Kano-Kaduna axis has historically used presidential rotation as its primary mechanism for accessing federal resources and influence. If the post-2027 architecture consolidates power in a way that makes rotation either delayed or cosmetically real without being substantially real, the North faces a structural weakening unlike anything it has experienced since the Abacha era. This is the actual reason the APC zoning debate has the intensity it does. It is not about party democracy. It is not about process. It is about whether the North retains its primary instrument of federal leverage. The Atiku peer opposition bloc. For the PDP and Labour Party to matter in 2027, to be more than symbolic, they need 2027 to be the decisive event in Nigerian politics. They need the election to be the thing that determines who holds power. If it isn't, if the real power decisions are made through institutional architecture rather than electoral outcomes, then opposition campaigns, no matter how well-funded or well-organized, become elaborate performances with no structural consequence. The opposition is fighting for control of a building whose locks are being changed while they campaign at the gate. Vice President Kashim Shettima. This is the name that most analysts are either not discussing clearly enough or dancing around. Shettima was positioned as the northern guarantor of the Tinubu ticket.
His presence on that ticket was the signal to the northern political networks that accepted it that power would return north by 2031 at the latest, either through Shetima's candidacy or through a northern successor with northern consensus backing. The expansion of the Presidential Advisory Council at the direct expense of the National Economic Network, which Shetima chairs constitutionally, is not a bureaucratic reorganization. It is a political signal of the clearest kind. Something has shifted, and Shetima knows it.
The 2027 electoral calculation. And I want to be precise here because this is where most analysis stops being useful. The calculation is running on at least 3 parallel tracks simultaneously. Track 1, win outright in 2027 and use the second term to complete the institutional consolidation that is currently in progress. This is the baseline. This is the public-facing strategy. Track 2, engineer a managed succession, a candidate who is structurally dependent on the Tinubu network and govern from behind the formal presidency, as Obasanjo attempted with Yaradua and as Babangida attempted through the entire transition program. Control without the title. Track 3. Use the constitutional amendment process to either create new institutional positions, extend the current term framework, or restructure the relationship between the presidency and state governments in ways that make the 2027 election less determinative than it appears from the outside. All 3 tracks, every single one of them, require the same foundational architecture: control of the National Assembly, control of the judicial appointment pipeline, control of state governors through fiscal dependency, and control of the security apparatus, which is precisely what is being assembled across all 4 institutional nodes right now. Follow the money, because this is where it becomes concrete. The NNPCC remittance dispute is not a technical accounting disagreement. The Revenue Mobilization Commission's own estimates suggest potential underpayment to the Federation account in the range of several trillion naira since mid-2023. That is not a rounding error. That is a fiscal reserve being held outside standard FACC distribution. And whoever decides when and how that money flows to states holds in practical terms the power to decide which governors stay solvent heading into their re-election cycles and which ones face fiscal crisis. That power is not held by NNPCC as a technical institution. It is held by whoever controls the political interface between ASOROC and the NNPCC board. And that board was reconstituted in 2024. Now, the silent stakeholders, because silence in Nigerian politics is never neutral. The Senate minority bloc has said almost nothing. Their silence is either consent or calculation, and neither explanation is reassuring. The Governors Forum leadership, specifically Governor Bago of Niger State, the current NGF chair, has made public statements of studied vagueness on the constitutional amendment package. A man in his position understands precisely what the fiscal emergency clause means for state autonomy. His vagueness is a private calculation dressed as public restraint. And the military high command. In any architecture designed for durability beyond electoral cycles, the security apparatus is never neutral. The recent appointment at the top of the military, Army Chief, National Security Advisor, deserve the same analytical scrutiny being applied to civilian appointments. The pattern of those appointments, looked at clearly, is not random. But here is what almost nobody has connected yet, and this is the point where the entire picture shifts. The Constitutional Amendment Clause on fiscal emergencies, the NNPCC remittance holdback, and the expansion of the Presidential Advisory Council are not 3 separate policy decisions being pursued in parallel. They are 3 components of a single mechanism, a mechanism designed to do something very specific. The ability to create a fiscal emergency in any state, trigger the Emergency Powers Clause, and override the governor's fiscal autonomy, legally, constitutionally, with NES approval already secured before the trigger is pulled. This is not a conspiracy theory requiring secret meetings and hidden agendas. This is constitutional engineering. It has a blueprint, and that blueprint, as I'm going to show you, was written before the legislation was drafted.
What does this mean for Nigeria as a country? Not as a political chessboard, but a federation of 200 million people. Nigeria's federalism has always been more nominal than real. The 1999 Constitution centralizes revenue control in ways that make states structurally dependent on federal allocation from the moment they are inaugurated. That is the baseline. What the architecture being built would do is formalize and weaponize that dependence in ways the Constitution's drafters, even with all their centralizing instincts, did not fully anticipate. A governor who cannot fund civil servant salaries without FAC flows, who faces a constitutional mechanism that can legally suspend his fiscal autonomy, and whose re-election depends on party structure controlled from a solo rock, that man is not a governor in any meaningful federal sense. He is a regional administrator with an elected title. If this trajectory completes, Nigeria will have moved, on paper, still a federation, in practice, a unitary state with cosmetic state governments. And the implications for every ongoing conversation about restructuring, resource control, and the Niger Delta fiscal architecture are severe. Every argument for true federalism becomes structurally harder to make when the federal center has eliminated one by one the institutional leverage points through which states could have organized a credible resistance. For ordinary Nigerians, not governors, not political analysts, but teachers, nurses, local government workers, contractors, the fiscal mechanism I described does not just exist in isolation from daily life. A state government held in fiscal limbo by withheld FAC remittances does not just inconvenience a governor politically. It delays salary payments for months. It stalls the primary school building that was supposed to be completed. It cancels the rural health center contract. It creates local economic contractions that never appear in the national GDP figures being cited in presidential speeches, but that are felt viscerally in markets, in households, in the choices families make about whether to keep children in school. The foreign direct investment dimension matters here too. Foreign investors, particularly in energy, telecoms, and financial services, make entry and expansion decisions based on assessments of institutional predictability and political stability over a 5 to 10-year horizon. If the working assessment among serious investors is that Nigeria's institutional framework is being restructured in ways that create elevated long-term political risk, the investment conversations that Tinubu's economic team has been actively courting become significantly harder to close. Not impossible, but harder and more expensive in terms of the concessions Nigeria must make to get capital in. On security, and this is where the architecture becomes most dangerous domestically. The non-state armed actors operating in the Northwest, the Middle Belt, and the Southeast are not analytically separable from the political economy I have been describing. Banditry and insurgency in the Northwest are partly, not entirely, but partly, fueled by state government fiscal weakness. The inability to pay and equip security personnel consistently. The inability to fund social programs that create alternative pathways for young men in rural areas. The inability to maintain meaningful local governance presence in communities that feel abandoned by every level of the state. A federal architecture that can hold states fiscally hostage does not reduce that dynamic, it amplifies it. And the consequences of that amplification are not felt in Abuja, they are felt in Zamfara, in Sokoto, in Plateau, in communities that are already bleeding. Now, that financial mechanism I flagged earlier, the connection between the NNPCC remittance holdback, the Fiscal Emergency Constitutional Clause, and the state governor's fiscal dependence. Here is what it actually does. It creates a trigger and release system. The federal government, through the NNPCC remittance mechanism, holds back allocations, creating fiscal pressure on targeted states. When those states reach a defined threshold of fiscal distress, a threshold that itself is subject to executive interpretation, the Fiscal Emergency Clause activates federal intervention. Federal intervention that replaces the governor's fiscal authority with a federally appointed administrator, appointed by the same president who controlled the remittances that created the crisis in the first place. It is a legal mechanism. It is constitutional. It is democratically framed because it requires NAS approval, the same NAS whose leadership was installed with executive support. And it has regional precedents: Pakistan's federal financial intervention model, India's president's rule provisions, the United States federal fiscal oversight of Puerto Rico through the PROMESA board. The critical difference in all those cases was that the mechanisms were debated publicly, challenged legislatively, and tested in courts before becoming operational. In Nigeria, this mechanism is being assembled quietly, in pieces, across multiple bills and appointments before any public debate has occurred about what it actually does. And here is the data point that most people on both sides of this debate have completely missed. The World Bank's 2024 Nigeria Fiscal Federalism Assessment, a technical document, not a news report, that received almost zero coverage in Nigerian political media, flagged exactly this risk. The document's language was careful, as World Bank technical documents always are, but what it described was a combination of centralized revenue control and proposed emergency executive powers that it termed, in its own words, vertical fiscal dominance with democratic override potential. That phrase, written by World Bank technical economists, not Nigerian opposition politicians, is a precise, measured international description of what I have just explained to you.
The international dimension of this story is not peripheral. For some of the actors involved, it is the primary frame. The US has a structural interest in Nigerian political stability that operates on two tracks simultaneously. The security track, the Sahel instability that is moving southward, the growing presence of Russian Wagner-linked activity in West Africa, and the pressure on ECOWAS as an institution makes Nigeria's internal coherence a US strategic concern in ways that have nothing to do with democratic values and everything to do with regional security architecture. Diplomatic cables, details of which have surfaced through Nigerian journalist networks, indicate that the US Embassy in Abuja and the State Department's Africa Bureau have been monitoring the constitutional amendment process with genuine concern. But Washington is unlikely to act publicly or forcefully until the 2027 electoral process itself is visibly, undeniably compromised in ways that cannot be characterized as internal party management. They will watch, they will signal concern through carefully worded statements, and they will only act when the cost of not acting exceeds the cost of the relationship friction that acting creates. China's calculation is different and in some ways more consequential for Nigeria's immediate trajectory. Chinese infrastructure financing in Nigeria, the Exim Bank loans for the rail projects, the Zungeru Dam, the Lagos-Kano rail corridor, is tied to repayment frameworks that depend on federal government solvency and continuity of policy. From Beijing's perspective, a stable, consolidated executive authority in Abuja, regardless of its democratic character, regardless of its relationship with state governments, is substantially preferable to institutional uncertainty, competitive power centers, or governance disruption. China is not pushing back on executive consolidation in Nigeria. There is no evidence it is doing so, and given the depth of its financial exposure, there is a reasonable case that it is quietly enabling it. The African Union and ECOWAS face a specific credibility problem here, and it is important to name it precisely. After ECOWAS's ultimately inconclusive response to the Niger coup in 2023, and after the AU's deeply inconsistent record on constitutional term limit manipulation across the continent, both bodies have limited moral and institutional authority to challenge what is happening in Nigeria, because what is happening in Nigeria is technically working within existing constitutional structures, not overtly violating them. The distinction between a constitutional coup and constitutional engineering is the space that Tinubu's architects are deliberately and carefully operating in. ECOWAS was not designed to respond to constitutional engineering. It was designed to respond to military takeovers, and that design gap is being exploited. For Nigerians in the diaspora, this is not an abstract story about Abuja politics. The international financial architecture of this story connects directly to conditions you live with. Remittance flows, diaspora bond instruments, and naira stability that affect the value of your transfers home are all downstream of Nigeria's sovereign credit rating and its institutional risk profile. A Nigeria assessed by international rating agencies as moving towards consolidated executive dominance over state fiscal autonomy and judicial independence will face sovereign credit pressure. That pressure translates into currency weakness, and currency weakness is felt in what your family's naira can buy the week after you send it. What I'm about to show you in the next section is where this story becomes truly dangerous.
Before we get to the strategic outlook, I want to do something that Nigerian political commentary rarely does seriously. I want to present the strongest possible case for the other side, not the weakest version of it, not a straw man, and then examine it honestly. The most serious argument made by those who defend or minimize what I've described runs as follows. Nigeria has always had a strong center. The 1999 Constitution was designed that way, deliberately, by a military to civilian transition process that prioritized institutional stability over genuine federalism. What Tinubu is doing is not constitutional engineering, it is constitutional governance. Every president in Nigerian history has maximized the powers available to them under the constitution they inherited. The National Assembly is not a rubber stamp institution. It rejected Obasanjo's third-term agenda in 2006, it has overridden executive legislative requests before, and it retains every constitutional power to do so again. And the judiciary, whatever its documented imperfections, has ruled against the executive on significant matters within the last 2 years alone. That argument is not wrong on the facts. I want to be clear about that. The 1999 Constitution is genuinely and substantially heavy executive. This is not contested by serious constitutional lawyers. The National Assembly has genuine institutional capacity to resist executive overreach when it chooses to exercise it. The judiciary has not been completely captured. These are accurate statements. Here is precisely where the argument fails. The question is not whether these institutions have the theoretical capacity to resist. The question is whether they will exercise it at the specific moment it matters, the 2027 election period and its immediate aftermath, when the fiscal emergency clause is already in effect, when the Supreme Court bench has been shaped by 3 appointments made through a compromise confirmation process, when 11 first-term APC governors are 3 months from their own re-election campaigns. Institutional capacity that is never exercised under the specific pressure that matters is not a functional check on power. It is a theoretical one. It provides legal cover without providing actual constraint. Now, the 3 biggest misconceptions that Nigerians carry into the story, and I want to correct them directly. The first misconception: this is just normal Nigerian politics. Every president does this. This conflates consolidation of electoral support, which every president pursues, with the construction of a post-electoral structural dominance that is designed to persist across administrations. These are not the same projects with different intensities. They are different projects with different long-term consequences for how Nigeria is governed and by whom. The second misconception: the North will never allow this. The Northern political establishment is not a unified bloc with a single decision-making center. The Sokoto Caliphate Network, the Arewa Consortium Forum, the Northern APC governors, the Northern NAS caucus, and the Northern business class have overlapping but frequently conflicting interests and time horizons. A divided North is not a blocking North, and the architecture being built is specifically, deliberately designed to work on the divisions within Northern politics, rather than confront the North as a monolith. And the third misconception: the 2027 election will settle this.
It will settle this only if the election is the decisive event. The architecture being built is specifically, deliberately designed to ensure that it is not. This is the misconception with the highest cost, because it leads Nigerians, ordinary citizens and opposition politicians alike to invest all their energy in electoral preparation while the institutional ground beneath the election is being reshaped. And here is the piece of evidence that most people on both sides of this debate have completely missed. The most important document in this entire story is not a speech, not a policy white paper, not an appointment letter. It is a legal opinion commissioned by the Attorney General's office in 2023, never publicly released, never publicly acknowledged, on the constitutionality of federal fiscal intervention in states facing what the document terms governance failure. That opinion's existence has been confirmed by two separate legal sources with direct access to the Attorney General's office. Here's what makes it significant beyond its content. It was written before the constitutional amendment bills containing the fiscal emergency clause. The legal opinion preceded the legislation, which means this was not reactive lawmaking responding to a governance problem that arose. It was planned. The conclusion was written first. The law is being built to reach it. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything.
Everything I've shown you, the appointment, the constitutional sequencing, the fiscal mechanism, the institutional nodes, and the silences, points towards three specific next moves. And I want to be concrete, because vague predictions serve no one. The first move, the constitutional amendment push, accelerates in the third quarter of 2025. Watch for the Fiscal Emergency Clause and the formalization of the Presidential Advisory Council's expanded mandate to be bundled into a broader constitutional amendment package. That package will also contain genuinely popular provisions, a concession towards devolution of some functions, perhaps a revision to the revenue-sharing formula that appears to benefit states. The packaging is the strategy. Nigerians who want the popular provisions will be asked to accept the dangerous ones alongside them. Legislators who want to vote against the dangerous clause will be forced to vote against popular reforms in the same bill. That is not accidental. It is the oldest legislative bundling strategy in democratic politics, and it works. The second move, a credible northern presidential aspirant is either neutralized or absorbed. If a genuine northern candidate, whether Shetima, a consolidated Kano political figure, or someone emerging from the Arewa consultative structure, begins to build real momentum towards 2027, watch for one of two responses. Either targeted federal fiscal pressure on the candidate's home state, creating a governance crisis that consumes their political capital and their reputation before the campaign formally begins, or an unexpected appointment, elevation to a position of considerable prestige and apparent influence that carries no real political base, no independent revenue access, and no path to building the kind of coalition needed to contest a presidential primary. Elevation into dependency is how this architecture manages competitive threats, not confrontation, absorption. The third move, the NNPCL remittance dispute is resolved, but on terms that entrench the mechanism rather than dismantle it. Watch the governors currently making the most noise about withheld remittances to receive partial visible settlement, enough to quiet the public complaints, enough to be announced as a resolution. But the legal and procedural framework that allowed the withholding in the first place will be codified rather than challenged. Watch for something called an NNPCL Federation Account Protocol, a technical-sounding administrative document that institutionalizes what was previously informal executive discretion over remittance timing and amounts. Once codified, that discretion becomes a permanent instrument of fiscal leverage over state governments.
What signals should Nigerians be watching for specifically? Watch the National Assembly Committee hearings on the constitutional amendment bills. Specifically, who is absent without explanation, who votes present without voting yes, and which governors send junior representatives to Abuja instead of appearing personally. In Nigerian political culture, managed absence is a vote. It is a way of signaling opposition without bearing the cost of registering it. Watch Shetima. His public statements over the next 6 months on the NEC restructuring, on APC zoning, on 2027 will be the most revealing political signals available. If he speaks with his characteristic careful diplomacy and measured loyalty, the arrangement between him and Tinubu is holding, for now. If there is even visible friction in his public framing, a slightly harder edge, a reference to northern interests that implies rather than states a grievance, the northern calculation has shifted and the architecture faces its first serious internal test.
Watch the World Bank and IMF's next Nigeria country assessment. If the language around institutional independence and fiscal federalism sharpens from their previous reports, if terms like governance risk or institutional concentration begin appearing in their public-facing documents, that is the international financial community beginning to price the political risk I have described into Nigeria's sovereign risk profile. What would escalation look like? A southern governor filing a Supreme Court challenge to the fiscal emergency clause before the amendment is ratified, establishing the legal contest before the mechanism is operational. A northern ACP senator breaking publicly with the amendment package, naming what the fiscal emergency clause actually does and forcing a public debate that the architects have been trying to avoid. Or a security incident in a high-tension state that triggers use of emergency powers before the legal framework is in place, establishing operational precedent before legal authorization. That last scenario is the most dangerous because precedent set in crisis is far harder to challenge than statute passed in debate. What would de-escalation require? A genuine binding governors forum agreement that takes the fiscal emergency clause off the table, not modified, not renamed, removed, combined with an independently audited NNPCC remittance transparency mechanism that removes executive discretion over allocation timing. Neither of those is currently on offer. Neither is being seriously negotiated, which tells you something about the trajectory. Where does Nigeria end up in 5 years if this continues? In 2030, Nigeria will have a government that is democratic in form. Elections will occur, parties will campaign, results will be announced and contested and upheld. But the institutional architecture surrounding those elections will have been rebuilt such that electoral outcomes no longer determine who holds structural power over Nigeria's revenue, security, and judicial appointment systems. The president of Nigeria in 2031, whoever that person is, will operate within a framework of constraints and enablers that were constructed between 2024 and 2027. The locks will have been changed, and the keys will be held by the people who built the architecture, not necessarily the people who won the election. Now, the question I opened this analysis with: is Tinubu building a second-term campaign, or is he building something that makes the second-term question irrelevant? Here is the answer that everything in this analysis points towards: both, but not equally, and not with the same urgency. The second-term campaign is real, it is active, it is being resourced and managed, but it is the visible layer. It is the thing you are meant to be watching. The architecture being built underneath it, through the 4 institutional nodes, through the fiscal mechanism, through the constitutional amendment sequencing, through the legal opinion that preceded the legislation, is designed to outlast any single electoral outcome. A Tinubu second term completes this architecture faster and with less friction. A Tinubu loss in 2027, if the architecture is already sufficiently operational, does not end it. It slows it, it creates complications, but the structure survives the election because it was built to survive elections. That is a political calculation that no opposition party, no civil society organization, and no international observer has yet grappled with seriously, publicly, and with the full weight it deserves.
The question this entire analysis has been building toward is not simply whether Tinubu wins in 2027. It is, By 2027, will winning even be the point? What the evidence shows, the appointments, the constitutional amendment sequencing, the fiscal mechanism connecting NNPCC remittances to state governors' dependency to emergency powers, the legal opinion that preceded the legislation, the silences of the people who should be speaking the loudest, is a political architecture being constructed to operate independently of any single electoral cycle. That is not speculation dressed as analysis. It is structural analysis of observable, documented decisions made by identifiable actors with clear and traceable interests. The mainstream conversation in Nigerian political media is happening at the wrong level. It is debating personalities when it should be examining the architecture that surrounds them. It is covering campaigns when it should be examining the architecture that surrounds them. It is asking who will win when it should be asking what winning will actually mean by the time 2027 arrives. Here is the question I want you to take into the comments and think through seriously, and I mean this genuinely because I want to read what you think. If the constitutional amendment package passes with the fiscal emergency clause intact, with the Presidential Advisory Council expansion formalized, with the NNPCC remittance protocol codified, which institution in Nigeria retains both the constitutional power and the demonstrated political will to challenge it? Name it, if you can. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what's really happening in Nigeria. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.